Hello, I'm Cory Burnell, and I'm your host again for this episode of Inside View. And this is our second of 4 interviews we're doing with our U.S. Representative, Tom McClintock. So, Congressman, thank you again for your time today.
And Cory, again, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me back.
You bet. Well, if you didn't get to see our first episode, we talked quite a bit about immigration, so take a look for that on YouTube. And going forward in this episode, we'll be talking about healthcare, and I guess we did cover the riots a little bit on our previous episode, so we'll talk about that and the civil unrest and the notion of defunding police probably a little bit more. But, you know, Congressman, we left off on our last episode talking a little bit about inherent rights, those principles that lead to good, sound policy here in our country. And on the notion of healthcare, if we can continue that discussion where we left off, we oftentimes hear, particularly from the left or the socialist radical left that's kind of making waves here in our nation of late, that healthcare is a right or that education is a right. So let's continue down that path on your thoughts there. How would you, what would your retort be?
Well, the problem that we have with healthcare is not too little government; it's too much government. It's totally destroyed the market mechanisms that put patients in charge of their own healthcare choices, and all of the competitive forces that keep prices low and quality high. Putting more of the same into that system is going to make it worse, not better. The Republican Study Committee, I've served on their board now for a number of years, has a comprehensive package of legislation to restore free market principles back into our health care, putting patients back in charge of their own health care decisions. Why, for example, do we have a law that says you cannot buy your health insurance across state lines? If you can find a better plan at a lower price in another state, why shouldn't you be able to buy that? You can do that for your car insurance. Why can't you do that for your health insurance? Price transparency. I just signed the Patient Protection Pledge in support of the Braun-Flores legislation to assure that all health care prices have to be provided up front before you start making decisions over your health care. I mean, can you imagine taking a flight from, here to Los Angeles, and only at the end of that flight having the airline say what the price is going to be? And yet that's the way our healthcare system is being managed. I mean, there is so much wrong that government has imposed. We need to get back to a system where people have the widest range of choices, have the freedom to choose the plan that best meets their own needs and their own conditions, and then we can provide, through a tax credit system, a way to assure that at least basic health coverage is within the financial reach of every American. But it ought to be their choice with the widest range of freedom. The right to know prices before you contract with a physician, and to those who say, well, you can't do that in emergency. Well, 90% of healthcare services are not emergencies. People have a right to know. There was one instance of a woman went in for a COVID-19 test and came away with a $6,500 bill. That's outrageous. Surprise billing practices are simple larceny. We need to assure that people have their power as consumers, that they can own their own health plan. I mean, again, because of all of the government interference in the marketplace, chances are you don't own your own health plan. Either the government does or your employer does. And your employer or the government chooses that based on their criteria, not yours. You can't fire that plan if they're doing a lousy job. You can't go for another plan. It is high time people had their rights restored to them. And as I said, for those who can't afford a basic health plan, we can provide a supporting structure for them.
Well, we're right back in the problem, the situation Ronald Reagan complained about when he said government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem.
Yep.
As you described.
And that is certainly the case in our healthcare system. It is gummed up the works to the point where people no longer have charge of their own healthcare decisions, nor of the range of choices that any free market would offer them.
Let's talk a little bit about this comprehensive package you mentioned that you and other Republicans have put together, I imagine that's going to be hung up in the House unless the House turns over to the Republicans in November.
Well, we could have passed it if when we had the majority in the House,
first
the
2 years
Senate
of the
had been a little more cooperative. Unfortunately, they weren't. The whole idea behind it was price transparency, freedom of choice, and then a supportive tax system.
Now, when you say we could have passed it, but when the Republicans had both houses, the issue being the Senate just wouldn't, they were adhering to that 60-vote cloture vote on debate, right? Well,
it's not, here's the thing, it does need to be reformed. Okay. And this is the problem. The Republicans of the Senate had a chance to reform it, and they didn't. Mm-hmm. You can reform the cloture rule without cutting the minority out of the process. Okay. But that's not what the Democrats are now pledging to do. The Democrats have made it very clear if they take the Senate and the White House next year, the first thing that they will do is abolish cloture entirely. That means the minority gets no say in the decisions. And then in very rapid order, and this is not speculation, they've already either vowed to do this, or in several cases they've already passed such legislation out of the House. They've vowed to pack the Senate by adding new states. The House already passed statehood for the District of Columbia. Obama's already called for statehood of Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. They can do that by majority vote out of the House, or out of the Senate. That means you have a packed Senate. They have vowed to pack the Supreme Court by adding 2 to 5 new Supreme Court seats, all appointed leftist justices. Then they've promised to bypass the Electoral College. They can do that by majority vote in the Senate by ratifying the Compact of States. It basically cuts all of the rural states out of having any meaningful say in the selection of a president. This is what they've already vowed to do. And then they will rig the election laws the way they have in California, provide citizenship to 22 million illegals, and that's game, set, and match for the country. That will lock in the most profound political shift in this nation's history, and it will be a permanent shift. There's no way back from that. You can't say, well, we'll beat them in the next election. There's no election that'll mean anything after that.
That is absolutely fascinating, and it's all in place.
Yeah.
And you know, every 2 years we hear it's the most important election in our lifetime. Mm-hmm. What you just laid out is actually true this time.
And then once they've fundamentally changed the mechanisms of our government, then they will change the policies. That's where you get defund the police. That's where you get the open borders, and that's where you get all of the socialist policies that have destroyed every country that has tried to employ them. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that a nation of free men and women have succumbed to the siren song of a benevolent, all-powerful government. But every society that has fallen for that lie is awakened one morning to realize that the benevolence is gone and the all-powerful government is still there. The Republicans featured a Cuban refugee the first night of their convention session, issuing exactly that warning. He said, "To me, what the Democrats are proposing is not radical. It's familiar. It's exactly what Fidel Castro promised us." And he said, "I had so many friends and neighbors who fell for that promise and then suffered, and many died because of it."
Wow. We spoke a little bit of inherent rights earlier, and so in this notion of socialism and the concept that there's an inherent right of some sort to healthcare provision or education provision, we see these are products and services that cost someone to produce. Mm-hmm. So speak a little of the difference if people hear that type of language from the left, how they ought to think differently about their rights.
People ask me all the time, why are things becoming so polarized? And if you look back in history, you begin to realize there are moments in a society when there are two completely conflicting principles vying for the future. They're antithetical. They can't coexist. They're matter and antimatter. In Lincoln's time, it was freedom and slavery. He understood that the two principles could not coexist. That was the whole foundation of his House Divided speech. Remember, he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand, and this government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free. He went on to say, I do not expect the government to dissolve. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It must become all one thing or all the other. He realized you could try to hold those two antithetical principles, freedom and slavery, in an awkward coalition, as the American founders attempted, but he realized ultimately one would devour the other because they're polar opposites. I think that wheel's come full circle, and now the question of our time is freedom and socialism. And as I said earlier, socialism and slavery spring from exactly the same rotten principle that Lincoln described as the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself, the same spirit that says, you work and toil and make bread, and I will eat it. He said, no matter what shape it comes, whether from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle. That is the root of socialism is in the same principle as the root of slavery. And it's back and is now presenting the greatest threat to American freedom in 150 years. And, you know, I talk to classes all the time, and, you know, what you'll hear from young people is, well, capitalism is that selfish, self-serving, never helping anybody, only helping yourself. Socialism is sharing. It's helping other people. And they have it exactly backwards. The fact of the matter is that there is no possible way to succeed in a capitalist system except by figuring out what somebody else needs and figuring out how to fulfill that need for them.
Complete voluntary exchange.
A voluntary exchange. You only succeed to the extent that you're serving somebody else. That's capitalism. What is socialism? Socialism is forcibly taking what one person has earned by serving others for themselves and their supporters. And don't mistake that for a moment. In every socialist society, it is the elites and their friends who profit enormously by stealing the sweat from the brow of the people who earned it. And that was as true in Lincoln's time as it is now in ours as we confront this new tyranny of socialism. I never would have believed that it would rear its head in this country the way it has, but it has. And now, in a few weeks, we're going to decide whether that is going to dominate our future for generations to come.
Yeah, you're hitting on, I mean, the most important ingredient here in this election. Of course, we have these individual issues people discuss. Let's talk a little bit about you know, the reform that occurred with Obamacare when we got the president's administration eliminated the individual mandate. How has that impacted health care and the freedoms that people have in choosing their health care, or the costs to health insurance?
Well, a little. You're no longer being fined because you cannot afford an overpriced Obamacare policy, but we were not successful in replacing that with the free market system. So we still have some of the worst remnants of the Obamacare system. As I said, you're no longer being fined if you can't afford one. But being able to get low-priced insurance outside of a group market is still all but impossible. You can do that for periods of less than a year under the federal laws, but it is no substitute for wiping out every vestige of that system and restoring to patients the full range of choices that a market provides, the freedom to shop across state lines, the freedom to set up HSAs, health savings accounts, so that you can pay for your medical needs with pre-tax dollars. In other words, the dollars you spend for your own care have no tax attached to them. There is so much that we can do. And as I said, for those for whom a basic plan is still out of reach, we can provide a supportive tax structure to assure that it's within their reach. according to their own needs. But that means they'll own the plan. They can take it with them from job to job. They don't have to worry about losing their health care if they lose their job. And they are assured that if that health plan isn't meeting their needs, or another one comes along that meets their needs better, they can make those changes.
Now, I've heard Senator Rand Paul talk a little bit about the ability to set up private associations that could have group plans. Has that become law, or was it part of maybe a reform package that you all in Congress have discussed?
It is impeded by the same government restrictions that have made such a mess out of our healthcare system, and it cries for reform. And again, the reform is not more government restrictions; it's fewer government restrictions, more freedom for individuals. Don't forget, as a consumer, you have enormous power. You have the power to say to a plan that's not meeting your needs, you're fired. You have the power to say to somebody who's offering a better plan at a lower price, you're hired, unless the government gets in the way, and boy, it sure has.
Not only on healthcare, but so many
things.
Topics, right?
My campaign theme has always been freedom works, and it does as a practical matter. This is not some esoteric ideological construct. This is the practical experience of free men and free women in a free system, in a free society, making their own decisions, entering into voluntary associations with each other, finding areas of mutual benefit, and making that exchange. I mean, that's how wealth is created in the first place. I give you $1 for a cup of coffee. What's going on in that transaction? I'm telling you that your cup of coffee is worth more to me than my dollar. At the very same moment, you're saying my dollar is worth more to you than your cup of coffee. Right. We make that exchange. We both go away richer for it. We both go away with something of greater value than we took into it. But now suppose some third party butts his nose into that conversation and says, oh, no. The coffee has to be in biodegradable containers, and it has to be at least 110 to 115 degrees, but no higher than 120. And it must include a swizzle stick, and you have to offer condiments within 20 feet of the point of sale, on and on and on. Every one of those conditions reduces the value of that exchange for the one or the both of us until the value of that exchange is destroyed. That's what too much government regulation does. Government's got a very important role to play in the marketplace. It's there to assure that contracts are enforced. It's there to assure that representations are accurate. You have to tell the truth. You have to keep your promises. Government's got a very important role in seeing that that happens. But as far as interfering with your own right to make your own decisions, that's not what government is for. And yes, it's true, we all make some really bad decisions from time to time in our lives. I happen to be living in one right now. But the bad decisions we make in our lives are the price that we pay for the freedom to make all of the good decisions in our lives. That's what freedom's all about.
You know, in your example there of the coffee exchange and the difference between capitalism and socialism, one thing I would say about capitalist voluntary free exchange, both parties say thank you.
Yes.
They say thank you. Now, in a socialist exchange, only one person says thank you, right? And they say, give me more, usually. And the other guy is upset because he's getting his pocket picked.
Well, I think that's a very, very good point. In any voluntary exchange, both parties normally say,
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Because both parties have benefited from that transaction.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating. Now, with the rioters, which we really anarchists in the way that when we see the looting and the property damage, there appears to be an attitude of no concern over voluntary exchange. If we want to stay on this topic here, it's just a matter of, hey, somehow there's something that they want their way, regardless of whether anybody else wants to.
Well, it's worse than that.
Have to deal with them.
It's the breakdown not only of civilization but of democracy. I mean, think about this for a second. Democracy can only exist as long as whichever side loses an election is willing to respect the will of the voters. The moment that breaks down, democracy, it becomes meaningless. Both sides have got to accept the will of the voters. That's only failed us twice in our history. It failed us in 1860 when the Democrats refused to recognize the legitimate election of President Lincoln. And it happened again in 2016 when the Democrats refused to recognize the legitimate election of Donald Trump. What's going on in the streets today, this resist by any means necessary, that was a slogan that dates back to 2016. And it is simply now out in full force, aided and abetted by leftist mayors and leftist governors who are unwilling to protect the people of their communities, who have deliberately withheld police protection from the people of their communities to allow this political terrorism to go on. Yeah. And that brings you to the other question, and that's the support, the pillars of a society itself rest on law, and law depends upon law enforcement. If there's no law enforcement, there's no law. And if there's no law, there's no civilization. And you need look no farther than the streets of Seattle or Portland or Chicago or New York, wherever the leftists have seized control, to see that playing out in real life. And what you're also watching is people now voting with their feet. They are fleeing these cities. I was reading an article yesterday about this army of moving vans leaving New York. The person who wrote the article said it's conspicuous now. Everywhere you go, you see these moving vans, and you talk to the people. And he says, by the way, they're all real liberals, and yet they recognize they can no longer live in the society that their votes created.
Well, that's why they make people in Colorado or Montana upset. Idaho doesn't like Californians coming there, right?
I have to tell you, the two things I hear the most often in this district, and I hear them every week when I come back, is, Tom, we love you, we lived here our whole lives, but this state has gone batshit crazy. We just bought a home in Texas, Colorado, Utah, Tennessee, Florida, Nevada, Idaho, you name it, and we're out of here. And by the way, not one of them's ever said, oh, and we're going to go move to New York. Right. And the other thing I'm always hearing is, we just moved here from the Bay Area, and we are very disappointed with your votes. And my response, I don't blame you moving from the Bay Area that has been turned into hell on earth by these policies. I don't mind you leaving San Francisco with its feces-covered sidewalks, its hypodermic needles everywhere you look. I don't blame you for leaving to come to the beautiful Sierra. But don't bring your bad political habits with them. At least connect the dots and understand that the votes that you were casting all of those years created the policies that produced the results that you're now fleeing from. And I think some people do. Yeah. But I've also noticed quite a few people don't.
Yeah, and let's talk about that, because when we hear of talk of defunding the police, from Joe Biden's
use Joe Biden's term, redirect. I'm not for defunding the police. I just think we should redirect them away from the police.
And so to the person who retorts, well, hey, that's Portland's problem, that's San Francisco problem. I don't care that that they're burning their places down. They ought to handle their own problems. You then have this exodus from those, and these are the same politicians who claim that there's a problem with disparity in income inequality. That's a problem that needs solving, and yet these policies are only going to make Portland a bigger slum, for example, in certain parts, and the disparity in wealth greater between the citizens that remain there and don't have the means to leave.
Well, right. Before leftist governors started shutting down our economy over COVID-19, we had one of the greatest periods of economic expansion in our nation's history, and the wages that were growing the fastest were those of working class Americans. This was very much a blue-collar boom. The wealth gap was narrowing. If you look at the increase in wages for those in the bottom rungs of the workforce. We know the policies that produce higher wages and income equality. We also know the policies that produce income inequality. Income inequality grew under the Obama administration. And certainly is growing in all of our major cities. And you're right, what happens is the middle class flees, and you are left with a radical difference in income equality. You have a few elites and a lot of people who are completely impoverished by the very policies that were enacted. That create rampant homelessness and businesses fleeing and jobs fleeing and income declining and all the things you see in these democratic jurisdictions.
Yeah, and as has been pointed out numerous times, these are jurisdictions run by Democrats that have implemented policies that have not. It was interesting to see the Republican convention. Maybe you'd speak to this. The number of minorities, successful people who have taken advantage of the opportunities in America, and it seemed like the RNC convention they made a point of pointing that out in this racially tense time here in America.
Well, again, until the lockdowns, Americans of African descent, Latino descent, women, we're seeing the lowest unemployment rate ever recorded in the history of our country. We had the lowest unemployment overall in 50 years. So yes, it was, as I said, it was very much a blue-collar boom, and it was snuffed out by, again, leftist policies that locked down an entire population, unprecedented in the history of civilization. But that was done in this and a number of other countries. They didn't save any lives, they cost lives, but worst of all, they did such damage to the economy that we're going to see, I think, a big increase in deaths related to poverty, deaths related to deferred health screenings. Again, authoritarianism produces misery wherever it is applied. Why can't people see that? I mean, I don't know of any exceptions to it. I truly don't.
Except for the very few who are the authoritarians.
Yes,
right?
oh yeah, the authoritarians do very well for themselves. That was the point that Mr. Alvarez made in citing his experience growing up in Cuba when the left seized control there.
Yes. Well, Congressman McClintock, thank you very much. We've hit the end of our second episode here, folks, so stay with us for the third and fourth episodes coming up with our representative, Tom McClintock. And on our next episode, we'll be talking about fire risks and power shutoffs. Again, I'm Cory Burnell. Thank you for joining us.